Okay, so I'm Anna Maria Mazzoni. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Turin, and also I'm a research associate in Qatar Environment and Energy Research Institute, which is a research institute member of Qatar Foundation in Qatar, Doha. And basically today I will guide you through one of my PhD chapters and papers, which basically evaluates the economic and environmental effects of Qatar's embargo that happened about 2 years ago. So this is, I will get through the introduction and motivation, and then basically the research question and the contribution that my papers give to the economic sanctions literature, the methodology which is different when I evaluate the economic effects and when I evaluate the environmental effects of the embargo. And of course, there is a big part that also regards the geopolitical and the international, regional and international relation in the area, which is very, very interesting from my perspective. So I will briefly also go to that towards the end. So basically, economic sanction, especially in the 20th century, constitutes one of the main instruments in trade policy to basically coerce a state to, or a countries into determined foreign policy decision, which in my case was the case when the quartet guided by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain kind of imposed the blockade on Qatar. So what is still somehow debatable is the effectiveness of economic sanctions, especially whether they are tariffs or non-tariffs, like in this case, and their effectiveness strongly depend on the political power and financial capability of sender and target countries, and also, and especially, how much are the trade losses for both sides, and for how long these kind of blockades or sanctions can be sustained. In addition, while I'm saying that I'm also outlining the environmental effects, is because most of the time, sometimes the trade disruption, other than economic losses, can also generate a countermeasure in the target states that can in turn affect the society or the environmental, let's say, framework or system of a country, which is, I will show you that that's my case for Qatar. So the motivation to push me towards this is also because the water and food security are a big issue in the Middle East, and they are even more important in the Arabian Peninsula and in Qatar, because Qatar have a very visible water resources. So the majority of the water resources coming from groundwater. So in Italian it's falde acquifere profonde. So they are not renewable, and the desalinated water is mostly used for municipal use, not for agriculture, not for other uses, because it's very costly. So Qatar imports, or at least used to import before of the blockade, 90% of its food, and of this 90%, 60% was coming through the Saudi border. So basically a big percentage of food stocks was coming from there. So the embargo, or blockade, that was imposed basically functioned in this way. So from one day to another, the quarter that I mentioned before blocked the land, air, border, and the airspace and maritime routes of the maritime area. So basically Qatar was suddenly landlocked. And in terms of food security and also water security, this was a big issue for the country. Of course, the event itself was a pretty sudden event, was like a surprise, was a very much exogenous shock. There is some historical background that can be traced back to explain the relation in the area, which is definitely not a very relaxed area in the world. So basically, the main reason why there were some kind of disputes already between mainly Saudi Arabia and UAE in Egypt against Qatar is because Qatar has strongly supported the Arab Spring in 2011, and especially political powers and forces that were opposed to regimes in Saudi and Egypt. Then there is also another fact that, that happened in 2014, where for a too much like independent foreign policy done by Qatar in order while in the GCC were discussing the ratification of an agreement. Again, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain and Egypt withdrew their ambassador from Qatar for about 8 months, and was basically the first moment since the foundation of the Gulf Cooperation Council in 1981 where there was this impasse. And moving forward much closer to my main event, there were the triggering factor where an hostage negotiation between Qatar and Iran that was not really well seen by the Saudi, which basically aspires to be hegemony in the area and in the Arabian Peninsula and in the area, and is openly opposed to Iran. Then there was the Riyadh summit when Trump basically tweeted and gave some kind of full support to Saudi Arabia, pointing the fingers against Qatar supporting terrorism. And also in May, there was a fake news and a hacking of a Qatari news provider, possibly allegedly done by and organized by UAE Saudi to foment the issue. And then on the 5th of June, of 2017, there was the declaration of the embargo by Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi, and United Arab Emirates. Following to the declaration of the embargo, which happened again by closing land, airspace, and maritime borders, there was also the request from the quartet countries to Qatar to comply with a list of requests within about 2 weeks. And in the list of the requests was, for example, closing Al Jazeera channel, stopping to support terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, which are considered, or like Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that was the part that was interesting Egypt, and so on. Of course, Qatar reacted, politically reacted as the embargo imposed and also these requests were seen like an attack to the sovereignty of the country itself, so it did not want to comply, and up to now the embargo is still ongoing. So basically what I observe in my paper are, of course, the effects on the blockade in international trade, so in the movement of goods especially between the Qatar before and after the blockade. And then from an environmental perspective, in the aftermath of the blockade, the necessity of secure food, so the food security quest became very much important and became a priority for the national security of the country, even much more than after the 2008 crisis, global food spikes, and so on. So the Ministry of Environment and the Municipality of Environment of Qatar decided to increase the local food production of and build and create a lot of infrastructure and really boost the local production of food and agricultural veggies and this kind of products that are highly water intensive. And given the scarcity of the water resources in Qatar, I'm not sure that these scenarios of food security is effectively sustainable from a water management point of view. So I will also evaluate that through the concept of water food security, and I will show you how it works later. Last, I will briefly, as I mentioned, make you aware of what's the geopolitical perspective and what's the regional and international reputation that Qatar gained after the blockade. And that this kind of reputation was also mediated by his kind of work in terms of international relation and diplomacy. So just to give you an idea of what we are talking when we talk about trade and water resources, so on the on the right-hand side, you can see the import and export, left, of Qatar before and after the blockade, expressed in trade values, and these are the Qatar's top trading partners. You can see that United Arab Emirates are the third, Saudi Arabia are like the sixth, seventh, and then there is also Bahrain down below in the list, and of course they disappear after the blockade. The imports from this country disappeared after the blockade, and then in the exports you can see that of course, since the exports patterns of Qatar, so Qatar mainly exports natural gas, oil and natural gas products with countries that are not interested in blockade because the main markets are in Asia with China, especially now, and then there is Korea and some in Japan and India. Of course, the expectation of the effects of the blockade on the exports is much less than it is on the imports, but still we can observe some. And one interesting thing that reinforces my identification strategy, which relies on the fact that the embargo was really an exogenous shock for the country and was unexpected, is also the fact that Qatar kept exporting liquefied natural gas to United Arab Emirates, even after the blockade, because United Arab Emirates import 30% of energy from Qatar through the Dolphin pipeline that passed like in the border, and it was also exported to Oman. So that's, in my opinion, is like reinforcing the fact that if it would have been more expected or like more announced or planned since before, eventually UAE could have rearranged better their energy security and so on. So on the other side, we see the water resources endowment. So we see that, as I mentioned, there are no surface water resources, and that the municipal and the agricultural sector are the most demanding in terms of water requirements. But the difference is that the municipal water is provided by desalination, which means that it's very costly, but it's only for municipal uses or for industrial uses. But usually industries in Qatar, like firms, since they are in the like oil refinery sectors and so on, they have their own desalination plants, so maybe their cost is lower. While instead for agriculture, for the agricultural sector, the main source of water, at least 85% of water used for agriculture in Qatar comes from these fossil aquifers, which once they are finished, they are done. So there is no way, because they replenish in geological time. So they used to be they are full now because they were replenished in like era when there was a wetter time period and so on. So that's a problem. And the other 15% of agriculture is actually matched by treated seawater affluent, so aquareflua and so on, but really in low amount, because there is some kind of resistance of using that kind of water for producing food. So it's also a cultural issue. So it's also a matter when we speak about water management in the area of not just allocative efficiency, but a more general like cultural and institutional quest. So the research questions are like, what are the effects of the blockade on Qatar's imports and exports? Which are the costs in terms of water footprint of the new food security strategy? And from a geopolitical perspective, I will show you what's the perception of Qatar from the regional and international vision. So my contribution to the literature, of course, is that it doesn't happen often to have actually a truly exogenous shock when you analyze an event study, which is my case. Also, I use monthly level data for trade flows, which is very nice because since I have a fairly short time period, so from December 2016 to, from January 2016 to December 2018, I can actually better disentangle because I can take, I have more time period because it's monthly. And also all the trade flows are at product level. So my analysis is not just at aggregate trade level, import and export, but I also construct macro category of product that I'm assuming were most impacted than others by the blockade, especially for the imports part. So, and then after seeing also the negative effect, the secondary negative effect on water resources, I can show that there can be a positive impact on Qatar's reputation after the embargo. The literature review is the standard, so I will not stay here much. So it's the standard sanction, boycott, and gravity literature. And then there is the theory of soft power by 1990. And then for the water resources analysis, my two main concepts is the virtual water in the Middle East, that was theorized by Allen in the late 90s, and the concept of water footprint by McConnell and Orchestra of the 2010. So the basic methodology, super short, is a diff in diff regression in a gravity framework where I identify the treatment effect and the substitution effect. So basically my final estimation equation, I will have Y, which is imports and export, which are estimated separately, and then my coefficient of interest are the one of the blockade, which is a dummy, which is equal to 1 when both there is a country that is blockading Qatar, and after June 2017, so for the embargo, I estimated with the similar fashion also a group of countries that cut their diplomatic ties with Qatar after the embargo in support of the original senders. And also I try to evaluate the same for another pool of countries that downgraded instead their diplomatic ties after the embargo was announced by the original sender. These two treatment effects, I'm just curious to explore if after a political announcement of support, there is also some action that is, there is some kind of follow-up action. And also this country really cut their imports and export and trade relations with Qatar. And on the other hand, I can also check for the substitution effect. So if the trade loss were somehow compensated with the increasing trade with some determined countries, which I assemble in this way. Either are countries that actively support Qatar, like Oman, Iran, and Turkey, sending goods and opening their airspace or giving ports as hub in the aftermath of the blockade, or eventually countries that publicly declared, journal, newspaper, and so on, that they were supporting the resolution, the Pacific resolution of the disputes among all these countries, and they, of course, eventually increased the trade of Qatar, with Qatar, sorry. And then, of course, since I'm in a gravity framework, I use a standard GDP and distance regressors and time and country fix effect. So for the water footprint instead, in order to evaluate the environmental effects of the strategies of MME for securing the food and the local production, I use a scenario-based approach. So I move within an horizon 2016-2030, and I first calculate the current and future demand for the domestic consumption in Qatar for 10 food categories. After that, I create 4 different scenarios of food supply strategies, so I don't analyze only the food security strategy imposed by the ministry, but I also calculate a baseline, which is we keep the distribution between local production and imports as before the embargo, so with a lot of imports. And then the other 2 strategies are basically the upper range and lower boundaries, so full imports and full autarky. While I do this because I'm able to translate food demand in water endowments, so how much through this water footprint concept, I'm actually able to translate how much water is needed to produce tons or kilograms of any goods. And in doing so, I can actually see how much is costly in terms of water to produce it in Qatar, accordingly to one of these scenarios, or eventually to keep importing it. So using the so-called virtual water, which is the water of another country that is using for producing food that you are importing in your own. And then, okay, so more or less this is the explanation for the water footprint. Gravity model data are like provided by the Planning and Statistical Authority, and then the GDP is from the World Economic Outlook, and the distance is from the CEPI database. Water footprint is also ministries, and then I have population in order to do the construct the food demand, current and future use population data, so historical data and population projection. Of course, I have the 10 macro food categories, which are based on the harmonized code and so on. And then I use the water intensity of Mekong and Orchestra for calculating the water footprint. So the results of the gravity, so of the imports, so of course, more or less, the sign of blockade and cut the diplomatic ties are as expected, actually. And while instead the downgrade diplomatic ties, no, because is negative but not significant, while instead is positive and significant in our PPML, which is not expected, but it can also be that actually they didn't take any action. They just say, okay, we just downgrade our diplomatic relation, but we kept going on trading with Qatar. And instead support resolution, we observed a positive sign in my major benchmarking. And in order to have an idea, other than the graphic content of the losses, of the actual losses, so basically from the sender countries, so the original 4 countries, the losses, the monthly losses on average ranges from $400 to $450 million per month. And while instead the gain in trade with the supporting country was 39% and was equivalent to 600 million US dollars monthly. For the exports, as we can see from the graph, of course, the exports decrease for the blockading countries, but they kind of went relaxed for all the rest. But even though still blockade as a negative sign, so we see an effect also in the exports, but not as preponderant. And this is, oh my God. And then, okay, same as product level, so we can see that animal, crop, and dairy are the categories that are most impacted by the blockade, because in fact they were the ones that were mainly coming from Saudi Arabia, so Saudi Arabia or the blockading country through the land border. And then here the results of food strategies, so total water footprint, you can see that it's very, so there is so in order, my food projection show that there is a very high demand, an increase in demand for all the SSP scenarios, which are the IPC, if you're not, I don't know if you're familiar, but they are scenarios that are used by IPCC to put together climatologic and other variables in evaluating effects of climate change on resources. And on the other side, we have the water footprint for local production, and as expected, basically I can see that the strategy that the ministry want to carry on is going to require 3.5 times more water than the current strategy by 2030. By 2023, sorry, and with further increase to maintain the same strategy up to 2030. And really, Qatar doesn't have this water amount in terms of groundwater, so then eventually this deficit will need to be met. If these strategies are pursued in fully, they will have to be met with alternative water strategies if they want to still produce locally. Otherwise, like with virtual water, they can go back to previous scenarios. So then just to like pop up on soft power in international relations. So the concept of soft power is basically the capability of a country of co-opt other countries and instead of use coercion, like kind of convince them into some kind of policy preferences. And usually one of the biggest examples is the US, and that does use soft power in terms of cultural let's say, exports and values and so on, and political values, while in case of Qatar, this exercise of soft power is based on foreign economic investments of any sorts, plus let's say, the advertisement of the state as a new brand state and its engagement in a lot of sport initiative and bidding, like the FIFA World Cup, in order to be visible and reachable throughout the world and also beyond the political and regional borders. And what we notice is also that, what I noticed is that basically after the blockade, they even increased this openness because they had all the border closed from land, sea, and air. They actually increased their openness, and since after the blockade, they really passed laws that granted more freedom of businesses and people movements inside the country. Which, like for example, before the embargo, as a foreign firms, in order to invest in Qatar, you were supposed to have a Qatari partner retaining 51%, so the majority of the ownership of the firm or of the investments. Now, foreign investors can have 100%. Property of any kind of investment they want to do. If we look instead of laws approved for movement, freedom of movement between people, after the embargo they passed a law where now 80 countries in the world have visa-free at entry. And many of those can stay even longer than just a month. So that's it. Sorry.
Maybe you
okay.
speed up. You can collect questions.
Okay. Let me just reopen this. Okay. Sorry. Hi.
Is relating to the cut of diplomatic ties, and if I understood, you had together the cut and the downgrade.
No, it's separated.
But you had it in the same regression.
Yes. Sorry. Let me go there.
You should try to see what happens if you
Put them together.
if you exclude the downgrading and you only take cut, or
Okay, or vice
consider
versa.
cut
Yeah.
as the next
Yeah.
case of downgrading, because I
That's wait.
expected to
Sorry.
when you put it in there.
Just a second. No. Okay. Lista. Sorry. So here, I do it separately.
Yeah.
You see, cut and downgrade.
Maybe try to see what happens if you put once at a time.
Once at a time, not in the same.
Once
Okay.
sensible each other.
Okay.
And, and the second comment relates to the gravity approach.
Okay. Sure.
From my point of view, the gravity approach implies that you need to include the country time.
Okay.
Otherwise, you
Okay.
have got madam mistake.
Okay.
So try to see what if your results are about.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Augusto?
Question is, has Qatar, like other oil exporting countries, built up a large development bank? This is a question to reply to this.
Well, can you? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understood your comment, your
Can you
question.
repeat your question?
Yeah.
Question is, has Qatar
Yes.
built up a development bank?
There are a few.
Very huge.
Yeah, there is the Qatar Development Bank.
Yeah.
But basically, if we look at oil revenues and liquefied natural gas, those revenues are mainly going in the Qatar Investments Authority, which is the investments authority of Qatar under the ruler family of Al Thani. So, and this is how they then reuse their and divide their investments and distribute them. So it's there, I mean, parallel to the banks, this is the way on how they are.
Okay. Marco and then Vittorio.
What is the exhaustion time scale of water resources, fossil water resources, in the case of business as usual and
Okay.
full autarky?
Business as usual.
Just for an idea.
Full autarky, I didn't calculate it yet. Business as usual, so looking at the current, still the projection says that it will be exhausted in the next 35-year maximum. So very, very short time. I mean,
Thank you. Vittorio?
Have Qatar used new technique for reducing the water content for production of vegetable and so on, like vertical agriculture and some
Sure.
sort of techniques?
yeah, well, the main issue is that they have the financial capability to do so, and the Ministry of Agriculture and the government subsidize very, very much the agricultural sector, also in terms of funding for this kind of new technologies in agriculture. On the other hand, among the active farmers and farms existing in Qatar, the majority still use the standard irrigation techniques because most of those don't really have, I mean, they kind of have their own pump from the groundwater, which not necessarily is licensed and registered at the municipal level. So there is a mismatch between the registration of the pumping system and the possibility of metering water by the government, which by law, this is how it should be done, and what happened in reality. So other than, I mean, they shouldn't have any problem, of course, in investing in new technology in any point of view, but
Also probably in human capital.
yeah. Yeah.
Maybe Giovanni, very quick question.
I was very impressed. I think it's a work which deals with three different researchers but related to each other, which use different databases. So it's really impressive. And I was impressed by your last comment that blockade produced more liberalization inside the country. Can we develop a new political theory? Looking at the relationship, not causation, between blockades, tariffs, etc., protectionism, and liberalization in the country against which we do it. For instance, in China, you could say that they introduced a new law on foreign direct investment because of waiting for new tariffs from Trump. So could it be? I'm asking political theories.
Well,
Maybe you are a political theory.
well, in my paper, this chapter is titled Qatar's blockade as a way for institutional change, but I don't know if they will allow me to say it out loud too much, because yeah, but it's very interesting to me. It's very fascinating.
So what we call deglobalization, instead we could say deglobalization as a way to enhance freedom.
Yeah. Even though I think that part of it is also because of the blockade is very much physical, so this kind of openness needs to be realized also in these ways, because otherwise it's... yeah, but thank you.